Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm diving into the world of education boards. Everyone has experienced education, so everyone has an opinion on it. But I'm delighted to be joined by an expert today. Jen Baxter is a trustee at Reach Academy Trust and the Reach Foundation. Previously, she was a chair and governor at Reach Academy Felton. She's currently the COO at the Chartered College of Teaching and previously held roles as head of strategy and planning at Teach First, where she worked with the CEO, board of trustees, and senior colleagues to develop and implement the organizational strategy. Prior to that, she was head of strategy and development of CFBT Education, now the Education Development Trust, having started her professional career as a teacher through the Teach First program before joining Deloitte as a consultant. Jen, a huge welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Jen, I want to dive straight in to the role of a school governor. So we have lots of education roles on the platform, and often it will be people going in for their first board role into a sort of school governor role. It can be a really nice pathway there. How do you think about that role in your mind? If you're describing it to someone who's never done it before, how would you sort of explain it?
Yeah, sure. So I think that in many ways it can be similar to other trustee roles, so that you're working as a governing body or a board equivalent in a charity to set the strategy for the school, to both support and hold the head teacher to account, to ensure the school is financially viable and that the money available is being spent to ensure that pupils are getting the best possible education experience. I think that where it can be different is that you really have to think about the pupils in every decision that you make. They are absolutely at the heart of what the decisions should be about when you're on a school governing body. And I think it can be really easy to have governing body meetings in the evening. A governor can come into the school at the end of the day, pupils have gone home, some of the staff might have gone home, and you can have the meetings, you can read the papers, but actually that's not really what the whole school is about. And I think what's really important is to try and understand ways to talk to that wider school community, so the school staff, the parents, the carers, the pupils, in a way that doesn't create additional work for the school leadership team because they are very overworked most of the time, but really understanding the community that the school is serving and making sure that you're bringing that to the decisions that you're making on a governing body.
And how do you go about that? I mean, my wife's a teacher, and that's been a real eye-opener to me to how hard teachers do work, because people on the outside will say, well, they've got all those holidays, but actually when you're married to a teacher, you realize that they need that just to catch up on the intensity during the term time, working through the weekends, and often actually working the holidays as well. So how do you be low burden on those sort of different stakeholders and still do the role effectively?
Yeah, so I think it very much depends on the school. We've trialled various things at Reach Academy Felton. So in the earlier days, some of the governors would have learning visits. They would go around, have walks around the school, maybe going through a couple of lessons, etc. But we were finding that doing that individually did create a lot of additional pressure or burden on the school leadership team who are arranging that individually with every governor. So what we have moved towards doing more now is having sort of one or two. So we have one day a year in the summer, which is all the local and governing body will get together and they will meet, the multi-academy trust board will meet on the same day at different times. And then there'll be a staff governor, a netball football match, then a barbecue with some of the team as well. So you can really get to talk to the teachers. But as part of that day, there'll be a learning walk. So you go around the school, you'll be taken around, walk into a couple of lessons to sort of see what's going on, get a flavour for what's going on there, be able to talk to some of the teachers to have those conversations. And that obviously, it is still additional organisation for the leadership team, but it's that one event a year. And we started to do that a bit more. We'll have a session where we'll have a training session at another point in the year and try to tie in meetings on the same day. And again, do that during the school day so you can be there and you can get a feel for what's going on. That has reduced the burden on the school leadership team to do that, but it's also a great way of getting a flavour of the school and just the joy of seeing pupils in the school and seeing how happy they are. Why would you not want to do that as a school governor?
And how do you, I used to actually invest in the education sector. So I used to go around a lot of schools and I actually sit on the board of a schools group now. And one of the risks I found of those set days, set pieces, is that they can allow for a very crafted and glossy narrative as opposed to that impromptu visit where you go in where you haven't got the teacher who's prepared their best ever lesson plan whereas actually what you want to see is that day-to-day piece. So how do you look through what people want to present there versus what's actually going on?
Yeah, so I think I'm very fortunate that Reach is very much a culture that people can go in and out and see lessons in a way that doesn't disrupt at all. So there isn't anything to hide in there. It's not like because a governor is going in, the teacher will prepare their best possible lesson, and you're not sitting in there for the whole lesson, which was something that we used to do in the early days, but we moved away from that. It's actually more about observing a multitude of lessons, because that's where you really get the themes of what's going on in the school. Are you observing the same things in 5 different classrooms rather than going into one classroom for a whole hour? You're only going to get one perspective from that. So I think it's really important to see as much as you can.
It's interesting. And so what have you found most difficult about the role? I mean, you have a sort of massive advantage having been a teacher and working in the education space, but lots of school governors come from commercial backgrounds and their experience of education was their own often. But what have you found most difficult?
So I think one thing that is really, what I personally found really difficult is being on an exclusion panel. These things can be really difficult, and you're making decisions there which have significant implications for a child's individual education. If you uphold the head teacher's decision to exclude that pupil, then clearly that has really big ramifications for pupil. Equally, if you don't uphold the decision, there are implications there for the board's relationship with the head teacher. So that's a really, really difficult one, and something which, you don't just leave the school at the end of the day after that meeting and forget about it. That really does live with you. I think the balance of challenge and support can be difficult. As you said, I think that's the same in a lot of trustee roles, but I think it's really heightened in education because head teachers and school leaders are absolutely passionate about education for young people and achieving the best possible outcomes, but they are incredibly overworked. And having been a teacher, I remember days where you'd arrive at school at 7 o'clock in the morning, you'd be back to back all day, you might have some lunchtime sessions you're doing, after school sessions, you might call parents after school, you haven't necessarily had time to eat properly all day. And then to finish that and go straight into a governing body meeting at 5 o'clock, potentially 6 o'clock, that is a very long day for the head teacher and they are very tired. And I think if you're going into that meeting as a governor and you're all about the challenge and not about the advice, not about the support, that is not helpful for that head teacher. So I think having been a teacher, really having that empathy for what their day might have been like. The rest may have been a wonderful day, but it might not. There are sacrifices that head teacher or other people in the governing body meeting are making to be there. They might not, if they have children, they might not be seeing their children first in the morning before they have to work. They might not be seeing them in the evening. So I think one thing that I always bear in mind is that meeting has to be a good use of that head teacher's time. And it's the responsibility, I think, for the governing body to make that so. So really coming well prepared, asking the right questions, providing challenge, of course, but also offering advice, offering guidance, and really making sure that you're respecting that head teacher's time because they are very, very busy.
I love that. I'd love to talk a bit more in a second about how you go about preparing for those meetings. But you touched there on support, which I think often is something, especially new board members, will get wrong. They sort of see their role to go in and challenge and grill the executive and forget what it's like to be in the hot seat getting grilled. How do you go about providing that support in an authentic way based on your own experiences in the education world? What is the useful thing for governors to do? Because sometimes it can risk sounding inauthentic, when someone comes in and says, "Oh, you've had a tough day, haven't you?"
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes just, a quick chatter at the beginning before the official meeting starts, how's your day been? And letting them sort of offload for 5 minutes can sometimes be just a helpful way before you start the meeting formally. I think that the support is ongoing, that it's not just in the meeting. So when I was the chair of the governing body, having weekly catch-ups with the head teacher, making sure that he knew that I was there if he needed any support, but also if he just wanted to talk through things. But equally, I'd understand if he couldn't make it because there's an incident happened at school and he had to be called away. And just that kind of understanding of how schools work and that it's not as easy as if you're office-based to say, okay, well, I can take this half an hour for a meeting because, something big happens in school. The head teacher is required to deal with it. I think that level of understanding of what it's like in the school does help. And it's not something that you have to have been a teacher to have. I think as you're on a governing body, you can kind of gain that experience.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's very helpful. So then in terms of how you prepare for meetings, you touched on the importance of that. And, I've certainly seen board members who don't, and it's a disaster. You can see them desperately trying to read the notes as everyone else is talking. What do you do? What's your approach to it?
Yeah, so I think it might sound very basic, but making sure that I go through all the papers in a lot of detail and I fully understand what the papers are asking me as a school governor. And if not, asking in advance, this paper is very interesting, but actually, what do you want from me? What is required for this particular item? I think is really important. From my experience as an executive, I feel like that preparation is really about respecting the people who've written the papers. And I think that's really important. So if I'm presented as a school governor with a set of papers, having gone through them, asking the questions in advance, if there's anything I need clarified, and then making sure I've really made notes. I know what I want to say in the meeting, but equally I can be flexible. And actually, if somebody else has covered that point, I'm not going to repeat it just for the sake of saying something. That's, again, not a good use of the head teacher's time. So really making sure that I understand. I think when I was a chair, really having a conversation with the head teacher in advance of the school governing body meeting to talk about, okay, well, these are the items that are on the agenda. We've kind of agreed this agenda, but actually these are the things that I think I want to delve a bit more deeply into, and giving the head teacher a bit of space and time to think about how they might want to then bring that to the meeting. I think that culture of sort of no surprises can be helpful.
Got it. Okay. Very helpful. Well, I'd love to dive more into chair role with you in a little bit. But before we do that, just sort of wrapping up on that sort of school governor experience, for anyone considering taking on a school governor role, what would be your advice to them? What are the things that they should be thinking about?
So first of all, I'd encourage anyone to do it. I think it's a really rewarding role. I think you can get a lot out of it while adding value as well. I think that, if you were going to become a school governor, I think one thing is really thinking about where you can add that value at the school governing body meeting. And like you said at the beginning of the podcast, everyone has been to school, everyone has an opinion, but that's not necessarily the right opinion for the school they're in. So I think if you're thinking about taking on a school governor role, I think part of it is also considering what type of school do you want to be a governor at? Is it your local school because you care passionately about that particular community? Do you want to be in an all-through school, or a primary or a secondary school? Do you want to be in a school which has a high number of pupils with pupil premium? Like, what is your passion? What do you really care about? And does that matter in terms of the school that you want to be a governor on? I think that not being afraid to ask questions. There are lots of acronyms in education, as I'm sure you know. And becoming a school governor, having been out of the education system for a while, I think not being afraid to ask about those, but also not being afraid to ask questions which may seem obvious, because it might just be that this is the way things have been done for a while and people are used to that, but coming in with a fresh perspective is always helpful, I think, and always encouraging people to ask questions on a local governing body is really important. And I think that if the school leadership need to be open to answering those questions. And I think if they're not, then that obviously will raise different questions as a governor, which we want to explore a bit further. I think also if you're thinking about being in a governing body, I think really never losing sight of why that school is there. So the school exists to give the best possible education experience for the pupils. And as I said earlier, really bearing that in mind when you're making decisions. And there will be a balance, because there'll be a balance around budgets and about teacher well-being and other staff in the school and their well-being, but really making sure that you are using the data that's available on pupils to really make sure that you're making good decisions.
I'd love to move on to talk a bit about the role of the school chair, because you went through an interesting transition where you transitioned from being a trustee into the chair role, which is interesting. Actually came up the other day in one of our peer-to-peer board learning networks, where someone was asking about how do I make that transition into the chair role. Tell me about your experience of that.
Yeah, so I mean, my experience was mildly terrifying, I have to admit, as we were doing Ofsted's inspection my first year as chair. So it was quite a baptism of fire there. I was very lucky to have a supportive vice chair, and he had previously been the chair, which I appreciate can create quite complex dynamics. But actually he was really, really supportive. And I didn't feel at any point that, we had very different ways of working. So I didn't feel like I had to conform to exactly the way that he had worked. But equally, it didn't feel like he was in any way sort of trying to become the chair again. It was a very conscious decision that he'd made, and I did feel really supported in that. I think my experience as chair, I did feel very lucky because it was a brand new school. It was a new governing body. So we were all learning at the same time, and we were all doing things for the first time, which is obviously difficult in that you have to spend a lot of time creating processes, creating templates, creating ways of working. So from a time perspective, there's obviously a lot required there, but actually there's also a lot of freedom to develop things in the way that you want to do. And lots of important strategic discussions happened, particularly in the early stages. So there was a lot to be done. And I would say from that setup stage, it was definitely overwhelming, my experience as chair at the beginning, but I did feel like I had the support of both the vice chair and the governing body as well. But yeah, it was a huge learning curve. I think that things I learned from it was around the importance of building the team, like that governor team, and making sure that you felt that you were on the same page and making sure that there was a really diverse skill set of knowledge and experience around the table. I think one thing in my experience that I didn't prioritise enough, and it's kind of one of my regrets, is really getting the clerking right to the governing body and the difference that having a good clerk can make. That's definitely something that I should have prioritised better. We had a brilliant clerk who relocated overseas, and after that we had sort of quite a few different clerks, and none of them quite worked out, and I didn't really act quickly enough. So that's definitely something that I've learned, having now both as an exec and as a trustee experienced brilliant clerks, that the difference that can make to how smoothly the board can run, how effective not just the meetings and papers can be, but the actual decisions that you make are better because you've been able to prepare better for it and have the right decisions and the right conversations. So that's definitely something that in my experience, I would do differently if I was to do it again.
That resonates a lot. Actually, Patrick Dunn talks about that in his book, Boards, of the sort of three areas where boards typically go wrong: people, purpose, and process. And process, I think people so often underestimate the importance of it. Like, can you expand a bit more on what was it that you now realize makes such a difference from having a good clerk or company secretary?
Yeah, so one of the things I think of is like freeing up some of the time of the chair. When I reflect on my experience with some clerks, I always end up doing a lot of the sort of clerking work, which took me away from having conversations with other board members. It took me away from spending the time perhaps in the school or talking to other teachers. So it had a negative impact on my performance as the chair. I think certainly the clerk we have now and the clerk in my exec role, the difference that they make is they are really proactive. They are sort of anticipating potential issues or potential conversations, and we're just on top of everything. So as a chair, you just don't have to worry about, does the trustee know about that this particular item is coming up, or are these papers going to go out on time, in a very basic approach. But, if people don't have the papers on time, they can't prepare properly, and then you can't have the right discussions. So from a very, very basic level, having somebody who's completely on top of things makes a world of difference, not just in terms of papers, but also around compliance as well.
Do you think in my experience, it makes a world of difference when you have someone who's really on top of all that administrative and preparation stuff? But also, I've often been lucky enough to work with some real strategic thought partners. Do you think that's sort of necessary as a school chair to have someone that level? Obviously, it's a rare breed of person who's able to do that as well as all the administrative piece. What's your threshold?
Yeah, so I don't think it's absolutely essential, but I think it's hugely helpful to have that sort of person in the role, and the sort of person who can make links between committee meetings and governing body meetings. Actually, that discussion happened over here, and this other discussion, which is quite similar, happened over here, but you're coming at it from a different perspective, and joining the dots in that respect, I think, makes a huge difference. And that's the sort of strategic perspective, which I think is really helpful in a clerk.
Now, you've talked about how that relationship with not only did you have the previous chair on your board, but you also had some of the other sort of the co-founders on your board, which can sometimes really blow up on people. Why is it that you think it works so well in your case? And if you had someone else in that situation where they were going to chair a board where they had those sorts of sort of stakeholders who, I think when I was doing the research for this call, I spoke with your previous chair, and he said, that they're a challenging in a good way, but a challenging bunch. So you obviously did, and he said you'd done a fantastic job of rallying them all around. What was it you think that allowed you to do that, and what advice could you give to others facing that situation to make sure that it doesn't blow up?
Yeah, so I think they are, an incredibly formidable and impressive group of people, and I have a huge amount of respect for what they've achieved and continue to achieve at Reach. I think the part of it is around, we were so all on the same page and bought into what we were trying to achieve and how we were going to do that from the very beginning. And part of that was because we've been involved in that part of the startup phase. So right from the beginning, we were all on the same page, putting in that bid for the DFE to set up the school. And I think that was a huge advantage. You're right, though, it is a challenge when you have the founders on the same boards. And people do feel strongly, and even though we're very much on the same page, there are clearly differences on certain matters. I think what I always try to do is try and understand everyone's perspective. I think I'm a Libra, so I always have that perspective on balance is always important, and the answer is sometimes in the middle, and everyone has a view and trying to come to some sort of agreement on it. I think that where there were issues which people did feel more strongly about, sometimes taking it outside of a board meeting if you knew it was going to be a contentious issue, and not obviously making a decision outside the board meeting, because that's terrible practice, but having a conversation, really trying to understand where people were coming from and whether there was any area for compromise, I think was a helpful way to deal with it. I don't think there were any issues which we weren't able to resolve through doing that, or through looking, what is the data telling us? If we want to do things a bit differently and there's a difference of opinion, what does the data tell us about the pupil performance, and how might that impact the decision that we make? And I think,
could you give me an example? Is there an example that springs to mind where you had those sort of, I think as your former chair described it, lots of brilliant people and lots of moving parts, and you chaired it brilliantly. Can you give me an example of where you really felt that sort of tension and how you unlocked it?
Yeah, so I think there was an example a few years in, and there was certainly some pressure to grow. And we certainly felt a bit of that pressure externally. We'd had the outstanding Ofsted report reasonably early on. And there was some appetite from people in the school to really grow and to start looking at, well, can we set up other schools, or do we look at how other ways of sort of reaching more pupils? And there wasn't always agreement with the staff at the school, with the leadership team, but equally on the board as well. And so, for example, one of the options would be to, suddenly to put in lots of bulk bids for set up lots more free schools. But actually, when we looked at sort of the pupil performance data, we really wanted to get it right within the first school. We really wanted to have a good approach and a good model. And whilst that might mean slower growth, the sort of perspective from the board was actually, let's get it really right and let's make sure we have an amazing model, and then let's grow. Let's scale when we feel in a position to do so. And I think that whilst there wasn't, huge arguments or disagreements at all, I certainly felt some frustration from some members of the leadership team that there was sort of a reticence to grow too quickly from the board. But that very much came from a perspective of, let's get it right for the students in this school. Let's work out what really works. When we take the primary students through to secondary, when we get our first GCSE results, when we get our first A-level results, let's find out what's worked, and then let's grow. And I think part of the issue with that, or some of the tension, was around, well, the opportunity to grow might not be there in the future. We don't know, preschools might not exist in the future. So actually, should we do it now or not at all? And I think we had to really sort of say, actually, this is what we think is the right thing to do for the pupils in our school. And that is, as a local governing body, our responsibility to make sure that we get that right. And then we can look to grow in the future.
And how do you think about that data? It always interests me in the education space, where I subscribe to the school of thought of never judge a person happy until the end of their life. And you don't know how well a school has set someone up until the end of their life, because actually it'll play out in different ways over their lives. And often my experience of schools can be quite focused on near-term sort of metrics, and they try to bring in commercial KPI mindset and looking at GCSE results or A-levels. As someone who'd come from a commercial background as well as an educational one, where did you find balance there, and how do you think about those?
So I think one thing that Reach has always really prioritised is making sure that the data is cut in lots of different ways. So you're not just looking at data by year group or by subject, but you're looking at all the different types of pupils in the school. And are we seeing any trends? Are we seeing anything which needs to be addressed? And I think that we were very fortunate that as a local governing body, we were being given that data. We weren't having to ask for data. I know that in some governing bodies, you really are having to ask for data so you can dig down. But we weren't having to do that. We were being presented with data in a way that was accessible to us as well, because school performance data is not necessarily easy to understand. So being given a way that's accessible, we had training sessions on how we can interpret the data, what the data means, which then really enables you, as somebody who has a basic level of data understanding, to go into and ask the right questions around those data sets.
Super interesting. And so that was sort of online platforms, was it? What sort of things, if I'm a school governor listening to you now going, gosh, we haven't got that, what is it that I should be asking the school for, or encouraging them to look at if we're struggling to get that data?
So when I was on the local governing body, and that may have changed since then, it was very much sort of Excel spreadsheets being presented to us, but we weren't being presented with the whole spreadsheet, which would be very difficult for a governor to understand necessarily. We were being presented, presenting certain cuts, and by year group, by type of, was pupil on pupil premium, for example, was the child looked after, and really looking at across each individual year group, each individual subject, each individual cut of the data, but also what trends is that all telling us? Are we finding out that actually pupils on pupil premium are not achieving as well as expected, or are they achieving better? And if so, what do we do about that?
Interesting. Okay. And what about on the staff side? Because it often strikes me that boards are sometimes somewhat blind on data on their sort of staff well-being. And there's so much good stuff out there, certainly in the commercial world, for sort of people analytics. And especially right now with everything that's going on in the world, there's a lot of burnout. How do you stay on top of your sort of staff data besides walking the floorboards?
Yeah, so I think there have been lots of improvements in that area. And one of the areas is sort of a brief survey, which goes out to the team and then making sure that, you're looking at what are the results that actually tell us over time. I think, you can do an annual survey, and that's obviously helpful about telling what happens every year, but how are people feeling week to week, term to term, for example? Are there particular points in the year that are really difficult for teachers, either because, preparation for exams or things that might be happening externally? And finding out then, well, if that's the case, let's, as a governing body, not ask for loads of data at the most stressful point in the year for teachers, and kind of taking those things into account, I think is helpful as a governor as well.
Interesting. And have you ever sort of wrestled with a problem? I've certainly worked with some educationists who say, don't ask people what they want, because if you do, you'll never hear the end of it. And it's a sort of road to perdition. Where do you sort of draw the line there and ensure that you stay removed from the inevitable politics and sort of personalities that will exist in any organisation?
Yeah, so I think that the data that you're presented with from the executive team shouldn't pinpoint any individuals in that necessary way. It should be, again, what are the themes? What does this data telling us about trends? And therefore, how can we act on that?
And for someone who's not sort of embedded in the educational world as you are, I could imagine it's quite difficult to know whether you want to go and get involved in an all-through school or a early years or whatever. How do you think about, if someone's sort of saying to you, Jen, where do you think I would be best? Like, how should I think about the different challenges, opportunities presented by those different roles? Could you give a steer on how to think about it?
Yeah, so I think it's really about what interests you, what motivates you to become a school governor. So is it just making a difference to pupils, in which case it doesn't really matter what sort of school you're in, because you're going to be able to do that anyway. But do you have a particular interest in the early years? Do you have a particular interest in data and looking at pupil performance data in secondary? Do you have a particular interest in A-levels and getting people prepared for university or for whatever their next role might be after school? So what are you particularly interested in? I think that as long as you feel that you have an interest, you're always going to then be able to add value, and you're always going to be motivated to do that and perform your best as a governor.
Okay, really helpful. Now, you also touched on there around the importance of sort of strategy and creating alignment and purpose. And my research for this one, your ex-chair said that was your superpower, sort of strategy. You also come from a strategy background. And I always really wrestle with strategy, both as a sort of board member and as an exec. I find it's really difficult to do well and to sort of get it cascading through the organization, whether you're doing that as an exec or a board. What's your approach to it? And one of the questions actually I often get is, who sets the strategy? And you get some people who say it's the board who set the strategy and the executive execute on it. And others will say, no, it's the chief exec who sets the strategy and the board will challenge and interrogate and help refine it. But what's your approach, and why is this such a superpower for you? What is it? What's your secret?
It's very kind of John to say that. I'm not entirely sure. I just swear it's my superpower, but I'll take it. I think that it's very difficult if you're in a governing body to be the ones fully setting the strategy, because you're not in the school all the time. You don't necessarily know how you might go about what you want to achieve. So I think there has to be an element of coming from the head teacher or from the leadership team, or if you're in a multi-carer trust from the executive, they have to be bringing something to you to actually discuss. What I find really helpful is not sort of on a governing body being presented with, well, this is the strategy, because clearly then all you can do is challenge on that. You don't really have an awful lot of scope to influence it. I find that having sort of and something that I do in my exec role now, so presenting a sort of very draft, this is our proposed strategic direction for the next 3 years, for example. Very short paper. I'm not a big fan of huge long papers as either executive or as a board member. What are your questions on this? What do you feel is right? What do you think you would change? And having a really good amount of time at a board meeting to discuss that very initial sort of draft, very short paper. So these are the priorities that we think that we need to be working towards. But this is the ultimate goal. This is what we want to achieve. Now, obviously in a school, that's often sometimes easier than with other types of organisation. But this is where we want to be 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line. This is where we think what we think we need to do in the next 3 years. And then having that, having enough time at the board meeting to really go through that in detail. Well, what is that based on? What is the data telling us is that actually the right thing to do? Actually, from then using your experience from outside of the governing body, say, well, actually, I've seen something similar happen elsewhere, not in necessarily the school sector, but in a charity sector, in a corporate sector. And actually, I think we could try doing things differently, or we should actually move a bit more slowly. That we should move more quickly with that, because we have a bit of flex in the budget here, or we don't have flex in the budget. We actually have to really concentrate on what is essential only. That's all we've got the budget to do. And I think having those conversations early on before you then go away, the executive go away and actually develop the strategy in more detail, I think is really helpful. I think as somebody on a governing body, if you're presented with something which feels like it's almost finished as a strategy, you feel like you have very little power to do anything there, and that's not the point of being on the governing body. I think equally, if you're asking the full governing body to develop the whole strategy, they're not coming from the perspective of knowing the school inside out to be able to do that. So I think there is sort of somewhere in the middle, but the conversations are really key around it.
And what does that timing look like for you? Because often, my experience, people run out of time. They don't start early enough. And so then actually it becomes like, well, we've got to set it. We haven't got time to explore this. Or the exec get frustrated because they just want to get on, or they've already started executing on it and they don't want to do an about turn. So do you have a timetable in your mind, if you're the sort of the chair of the board, of when you want that first version in and when you're sort of trying to lock it down by?
Yeah, so I would say that, you'd be wanting it at least sort of 4 to 6 months before it's due to be implemented, because you need all the time to actually then work it up and then to work up the budget and make sure that aligns. And so I'd say ideally sort of 6 months in advance, you'd be wanting that first discussion. And I don't think it's always an agenda item on a longer meeting. I think quite often that is a very specific meeting where you're purely focused on that to make sure that you're not then distracted by other particular topics and you really give it the time that it needs.
You talked about stepping into this trustee role on the Multi-Academy Trust. I think people are often sort of wondering whether they should take on a school governor role or a multi-academy trust role, and often sometimes hear people say, well, as a multi-academy trust board member, the challenge complexity is much greater and more interesting, and my opportunity to influence is greater. What's been your experience of that and the difference between the two?
So I think the opportunity to influence is huge on both, to be honest. I think you're just looking at it from slightly different angles. So there are lots of similarities. I think making sure that whether you're on a governing body or whether you're on a trust, make sure that you have the right people around the table, the right structures, the right accountability, the right level of support and challenge. I think even if you're in a multi-academy trust, still keeping the pupils at the heart of decisions is important. And I think it's probably easier to lose sight of that when you're in a multi-academy trust rather than a local governing body. There are obviously some sort of, on a technical level, a multi-academy trust is a charitable company. So you have filing responsibilities, legal responsibilities, funding agreement from the EFA, etc. But the overall principles, I think, of what you're doing are the same, whether you're on a school governing body or on a multi-academy trust. And that's really making sure that the children in that school or in that trust are getting the best possible educational outcomes. But I think that the role you play is slightly different, as you sort of mentioned. So local governing bodies, they're very much providing the support and challenge to that individual head teacher or the individual leadership team as they implement the policies and the processes and the priorities which have been agreed by the multi-academy trust. So some specific examples, I think at a multi-academy trust board meeting, you might be looking at how to make financial efficiencies through procurement or economies of scale because you have more than one school. You might be looking at how professional development can be improved for teachers because you have more than one school, you have more teachers to be able to support with that. You might be talking about succession planning for school leaders across schools and how the wider curriculum across all the schools can be wider and broader because you have more teachers, more specialisms within that. And whereas I think at the local governing body meeting, you obviously will talk about succession planning for teachers, but you're looking at that particular school. You're not looking at wider than that necessarily. So I think it does tend to be more strategic from my experience. And I see the other thing on the multi-academy trust is there's certainly a lot more conversations about growth. So the when, the why, the how much, and really then putting in place the structures to focus on that. So for example, at the trust, we have a growth working group, which is set up for a finite amount of time. It reports to the multi-academy trust boards, and they are really looking in depth at what growth could look like and then reporting that to the board. And I think that sort of strategic discussion is definitely something that happens more at the multi-academy trust level.
Really interesting. One of the things that I've wrestled with sometimes has been, it strikes me as one of your greatest sort of levers for efficiency in an education or schools group is your contact hours and the mix of your teaching staff. Obviously, if you've got everyone at the sort of top end of the pay scale, it's a very different cost from if you've got everyone at the bottom end of the pay scale. But equally, your ability to deliver a quality education relies on actually you probably want a spectrum and a healthy churn. But I've often found it very difficult to really get under that. And often I sort of feel like I'm coming at it from quite a commercial angle and I'm not necessarily getting through to those operating on the sort of the education side. As someone who's kind of sat on both sides of that fence, what's been your approach to that and in the sort of multi-academy trust arena?
Yeah, so I'd say that what really needs to be presented when you're looking at the budgets is, how many different staff do you have at the different levels within the organisation and different pay scales, and therefore what impact is that likely to have on your budget going forward? So not just looking at the next year, but looking at the next few years. If they'll continue on that trajectory, what is your budget looking like in the next few years? And very much then using that to think about, or to encourage the leadership team to think about recruitment and actually where do they want to focus? Do they need to recruit actually a number of new teachers? Because actually that is going to help to not only just balance out the budget, because you have to have some element of commercialism, but actually schools aren't just about that, but also thinking about the different skills and experience that they're bringing to the school, because you need to have succession planning for that. And if you're not hiring new teachers at any point, then you're not going to build a succession of leaders. So I think it is really important to look at all of the data and information telling you what the staff are, what levels they're at in terms of budgets, but also think about what does that mean in terms of recruitment and linking it back.
What's been your experience of sort of interview processes as both, or maybe start with your experience as a candidate, but then I'd be interested to hear your perspective as a panel member or interviewer.
Yeah, so I think that in thinking about sort of trustee or governing body roles, I think treating the process as you would a process for recruiting an employee, that level of professionalism, I think, is really important. And I think that having a very clear role description for what it is you want, for, if it's a governing body member or a chair, having a really clear role description is absolutely important. Having a really clear and professional process, I think, makes a big difference. So, for example, a few years ago, we actually worked with you to recruit a chair of our Finance, Risk and Audit Committee. And I think we had a very clear role description, a very clear process. We, in the interview panel, was entirely on the same page, the type of skills that we wanted that would really help us to grow. It wasn't about what skills do we need for now, but what skills do we need for the next 5 years to really help us grow. And being very clear about that, and being very clear with the person coming or the people coming for interview. Actually, this is what we want. Tell us about how you can actually bring those skills. What advice and guidance can you give us to help us grow? I think is really, really important. You also think just very basic things like having proper time set aside for the interview process. So not just doing it as an add-on at the end of the day when people are flagging a little bit, really, as I say, treating it like an employee recruitment process, I think is really key.
Yeah, it's amazing how many organizations do that. They've sort of jammed it in and the candidates feel it, that they're not really sort of engaged, and it sort of leaves a very bad impression.
Yeah,
and makes them much
it really
less
feels
likely,
like an aftertaste.
Yeah, makes them much less likely to want to take on the role. What sort of questions do you ask people?
So, I mean, that really obvious one is, why is it this specific governing body or multi-academy trust board or charity? Why is it that you want to be part of this particular one? You could apply to be a governor or a trustee on any of those. What is it that particularly interests you? And I think part of that is working out, are they really aligned with your strategy? Do they understand what you want to achieve? And are they on the same page? One question I always like to ask is how they would balance the demands of the trustee or governor role with their employment or the other charitable activities, non-exec positions, etc. And that's not to say they should be able to, at the drop of a hat, do anything you want with their time. But I think having that time is really important. And as somebody personally, I've sometimes struggled with that sort of balance of time with family and work and chair roles or trustee roles. I think asking that and just having that really honest conversation about how they would balance it, I think is important at the early stages. Things that I also like to ask is, how can they help the organisation, not just now, but over the next few years? Because I don't think what you want to do is recruit trustees for the now. I think what you want to be is recruiting trustees for the future as well. Working out how can they help you to grow, or whatever your particular objectives are, how can they specifically help with that? Sometimes I've asked things about how they would balance the focus between strategic and operational. You sometimes get trustees who prefer to be operational, and that is really the role of the exec. So making sure that they fully understand that early doors, I think, is really helpful. We've also asked some specific questions in the past, which has been really based on where the organisation is at the time. So, for example, as Finance, Risk and Audit Committee, when we were seeking a chair for that, how they would effectively make recommendations to a board on commercial and financial matters when the board didn't necessarily come from that sort of background. And what we wanted to find out there was how they make that information or their recommendations accessible to people who weren't experts in that area.
Interesting. What is a sort of good response and what is a bad response look like there? Are you able to sort of paraphrase or summarize what that might look like?
Yeah, so I think in practice, what that looks like is really sort of taking out all the acronyms, taking out the specific terminology that you might only understand if you are very close to that, and really breaking out what does this mean? What the finance is telling us? What does it mean for the organisation? And what does that mean for the decisions that you're being asked to make in the rest of this trustee meeting? And I think that's a sort of helpful way of breaking it down.
Yeah, so when sort of, expert speakers always make things sound so simple and easy, it takes that sort of expertise to break it down like that.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
what you said around engagement also really resonated. I'd say that's sort of one of the most common pitfalls we see people falling into on the platform is they find people who can certainly bring the insight, but they don't have the capacity to really engage. And so they have, this mega CV, have done all sorts of amazing things, but ultimately they're just not engaged in the organization. And often actually, I think you're better off as a board of having someone who is engaged and slightly less insightful, still capable, but slightly less insightful than the other way around, because the engagement is the basis on which I think everything is built.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Yeah, I think having somebody who is able to commit what you need is really, really important. It's no good having somebody who's really insightful but can only join one meeting a year and does very little in between. I think actually what you need is people who are really, engaged and understand. A part of this is around setting expectations early on. So when you're recruiting a trustee, it's not just about, we've got 4 meetings a year, we expect you to read the papers and attend them. What else do you expect? Like, how are they going to be able to do that role properly? What engagement do they need with the rest of the organisation to be able to do that role properly? And setting that out from the beginning, because then that gives people the choice to say, well, actually, that's not for me. I can't commit the time for that. Or, yeah, that's absolutely fine. I can do that.
Yeah. And are there any sort of red flags that you look out for in people's responses? I mean, the classic one for me is when someone turns up and says, so why should I want to be on this, the board position? And sort of the arrogance is just sort of staggering.
Yeah.
Like, well, actually, but what are the red flags for you when you're interviewing people?
I mean, that's a huge one. And we have had that before. I've experienced that where people are very much like, well, of course you would want me. And I think that's definitely a red flag. I think also people who want to help and make a difference, but they don't particularly care about your individual charity, or not that they don't care, but it's not their passion. They just want to make a difference. And sometimes it's about ticking a box, sometimes because they genuinely want to, but they haven't really found the area that they're really interested in. And I think for me, that's an issue because I really would want people on the board who are passionate about what you're trying to achieve. I think working in charities and in education, that's so essential. So what you do, you don't do it for the big bucks and retiring early. You do it because you're genuinely passionate and you want to make a difference. And there are lots of ways to do that in different charities and in different types of schools and multi-academy trusts, but really making sure that, or really getting somebody who understands what you want to do and is on board with it and is really excited about it. Because the more excited they are, the more likely they are to want to give up their time to support and really want to engage, which is hugely important.
Yeah, really interesting. That's very consistent with what we see on the platform, where we see charities and nonprofit education place much more emphasis on reasons for application, whereas the commercial organizations don't really care so much about the reason for application. They're just looking for the skill sets, we often see some really good people on paper who get rejected by education or nonprofit organizations because they just haven't evidenced enough passion for that specific role and organization.
And we absolutely want the skill sets too. I mean, you hugely need them, but having that alongside the passion is really, really key.
Brilliant. Now, there was one last I asked John, who's your former chair, what question should I be asking Jen that you think others would be interested to hear about? And he said one of the things that you've talked a lot about recently is how do you balance a passion project with family life, and that really resonated for me. I've got sort of 2 kids under 5, and building Nurole is a passion project. But what's been your take on that?
Yeah, so it's been really challenging, if I'm very honest. So my eldest has just turned 6, and my youngest is 2. So yeah, 2 reasonably young children and a busy job as well. And I think that one thing that I've had to learn personally is that admitting that you don't necessarily have the time to do something is not a sign of weakness. So after I'd had my second child and I was looking at, I was chair of the local governing body, I had to sort of step back from that. When at one point I was on the Multi-Academy Trust, I was on the Reach Foundation, I was chairing the Finance and Audit Committee, and I just wasn't doing them justice. And I think a younger version of me would have very much said, no, you just have to carry on and keep going and
work hard,
find a way to make it work and stay up later at night, even though you're not getting any sleep at night. Yeah. But I think at that point, I recognized that it wasn't working. And it's not about it not necessarily working for me, but it wasn't going to work for other people because I'm not able to give the right amount of time and commitment to it. That's not fair on people who are giving 100% the whole time and working very hard. So I had a conversation with John at the time, and I talked about, where can I actually add the most value while stepping back a little bit. And that's not about, not doing anything, because I'm hugely passionate about Reach, multiplicator trust and foundations. I still want to be involved. I really want to do things, but the reality is I'm not going to be able to make it to Felton. So I live in North London. I'm not going to make the almost 2-hour trip hugely regularly, but I still think I can add value. So we had a very long conversation, and we decided I would step back from the chair of the Finance and Audit Committee. But once we had a really good chair in place, and actually we found someone amazing, which is brilliant. So I helped sort of see that transition. And then I still sit on the foundation of trust, and that's been easier for me to be able to do. So I think part of it is recognizing where your limits are, which I think is difficult when you're the type of person who always wants to be able to do everything and thinks that you should be able to do everything. But there is a reality that you do need to sleep sometimes, even if your children don't agree with that. It certainly is a factor into it. And you do need to have some sort of time which is not doing your passion project or working or looking after your children as well.
Brilliant. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that resonates a huge amount.
It takes a lot of discipline though.
It does. The time has flown by. So it's time to move into our 5-question quickfire as part of the wrap up, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Yeah.
Great. So the best book that every board member should read, and why?
It's hard to pick one, isn't it? So I think the Scout Mindset by Julie Galef is something which I found really useful. And it's about soldier mindset and Scout mindset. And soldier mindset would be about being sort of defending a particular position and belief. And whereas Scouts have to understand the terrain, they have to understand the landscape, they have to overcome obstacles, get an accurate view of reality, and how actually the Scout mindset is a really helpful way of making decisions. And that's something that I think is really helpful in the board context.
I love that. I have not read that one. I'll add it to my list.
Recommend it.
Your favourite quote and why?
So I'm not particularly the type of person who lives life by motivational quotes, but I grew up in the Northeast, not that you tell it by my accent, but I grew up in the Northeast, and a saying that always stays with me is that shy bairns get out. And it literally translates as shy children get nothing, but that's not the way it's really used. What it's about is about speaking up for yourself. And I think that's something that I often need to remember in particular meetings, that actually I do have something to say and that I do need to speak up for myself in that particular area. But it's also something that I do quite frequently in my day-to-day life as well.
Love it. Your best ever holiday and why?
Can I separate this out into pre-children and post-children? So,
yeah.
Pre-children, my best ever holiday, I think, was traveling around Vietnam. And I think the real mixture of amazing heritage sites and history and culture and amazing beaches and scenery and busy cities and food and people, it was just phenomenal. I had such an amazing time doing that. And post-children, it would be last year. So we had 3 years of no holidays, as most people because of COVID. And it was my youngest first time abroad. And it's the first time we kind of taken the time since she'd been born to really have some space as a family and not be in the house. And it was really special to spend some sort of 3 weeks away in Menorca together, just being a family and doing very basic things like being in the sea and being in the pool. And it was really lovely.
Fantastic. Your most significant professional insight?
So I'm not sure it's an insight, but certainly a principle that I adhere to, that it's always possible to hold people to account at the same time showing compassion. And it's always possible to challenge while also being kind and supporting people in that. I don't think they're all mutually exclusive. And I think it's really important to all do both or do all of those at the same time.
And last but not least, your favourite podcast or app if you don't listen to podcasts?
I listen to podcasts a lot. So my favourite podcast is More or Less, The Truth Behind the Statistics with Tim Harford. I find it a really accessible way of analysing data on current affairs. And for something more hearted, it's always something to do with Adam Buxton.
Fantastic. Jen, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and I've learned a lot. So really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.